At 5:47 in the morning, the ruined streets were quiet enough that she could hear individual bricks settling in the shattered walls. A soft breeze pushed dust through a collapsed doorway, carrying the faint smell of burned plaster and damp stone. Somewhere out there, beyond the fragments of her cover, glass crunched under a boot. Not close. Careful. Someone who knew how to move. Ludmila lay behind a fractured section of foundation, cheek pressed to the stock of her worn rifle, watching the narrow strip of street framed in her scope. 40 meters to her left, a Soviet sergeant lay hidden behind the twisted frame of an overturned cart, trying very hard to look like part of the rubble. To anyone without optics, he had vanished. To a patient German marksman, he was just a paused target. She found the glint first. Not a full flash, just a tiny change in brightness along a broken wall opposite the sergeant, as if a shard of glass had rotated slightly. Then the smallest movement, the top edge of a helmet easing into the gap where plaster had fallen away days earlier. The angle was perfect. Whoever was behind that wall had chosen his spot long before today. Her hands didn't shake. They felt oddly distant, like they belonged to someone she was observing rather than someone she was inhabiting. 6 hours earlier, she'd arrived at this sector with a folded note in her pocket confirming her posting as a sniper. Now she was lying in the dust, a history student turned hunter, with 40 rounds of ammunition and no confirmed eliminations. The front had not cared about her degree. It cared whether she could solve the kind of problem now unfolding across the street. She shifted the scope half a finger width, centering the narrow crack where she'd seen the helmet. The sergeant to her left had no idea anyone was watching him. He'd shared his bread with her the previous evening when she hadn't eaten in nearly a day, laughing off his own hunger. Married, 2 children, a photograph of both tucked near his heart. She knew because he'd taken it out to show her, speaking quietly about a small garden and a city that no longer looked like this one. The German marksman had settled his sights now. She could feel it from the way the helmet stayed absolutely still. He was waiting for that small, natural movement, an elbow shifting, a glance over cover, a moment of curiosity. She did the calculations without thinking. The instructor at the training range had drilled the sequence into her until it felt like breathing. Distance, just under 300 meters. Crosswind, light, steady, sliding from the left. Target, mostly hidden, only a fraction of the helmet visible through the masonry gap. She reminded herself of the phrase the instructor had used again and again. Don't think about removing a life. Think about solving an equation. Distance, wind, time. Solve the equation. Her finger eased against the trigger. For a heartbeat, she was back on the university range, the world narrowed to a circle of metal and glass and a point she needed to touch. Only this time, the target on the other end had a name, an accent, habits, a family somewhere. This time, if she hesitated, the friendly shape to her left would never stand up again. She exhaled slowly and chose. The rifle kicked into her shoulder with a familiar, solid push. The sound knifed through the morning, echoing against ruined stone. Through the scope, she saw the helmet snap backward as if yanked by an invisible line. The dark slit in the masonry disappeared. Opposite her, the sergeant flinched, hands gripping his weapon tighter, eyes scanning for danger he still couldn't see. She worked the bolt on instinct, chambering another round before her brain caught up to what her body had done. No other movement. No answering shot. Whoever had been behind that wall was no longer part of this fight. There was no surge of triumph, no cinematic relief. Just a tiny shift in how the world felt. A line had been crossed. A problem had been solved in the only way the front allowed. The sergeant would rise later and never know how close he had come to vanishing. She would know. When the noise died down, when the city returned to its constant background murmur of explosions and shouted orders. She sat with a new realization. She was no longer a student borrowing a rifle. She was a specialist with a job to do. The strange thing was how little changed inside her. She didn't feel like a different person. The same thoughts pressed at the edges of her mind. Her destroyed campus, her friend who hadn't escaped the library, the professor whose lectures had made history feel like something alive rather than words on a page. They were still there, woven into the same person who had just taken a life from 300 meters away. She pulled herself back behind the rubble, aware now that her own muzzle flash might have been seen. Old habits from the manual took over. Relocate, change angle, never invite a second shot from someone watching. She slid along the broken floor, using debris to break up her outline, and settled into a new position where she could watch the same sector from a different perspective. The sergeant finally moved, crawling backward and then disappearing into a trench cut between the buildings. He waved once in her direction without seeing her, a small, grateful gesture to whoever had shouted the warning he never heard. She watched him go, then turned her attention back to the wider scene. This, she realized, was only the first entry in a ledger that would fill faster than she could imagine. At the moment, all she knew was that one shot had worked. One equation had been solved. There would be another, and each would ask the same question. Could she act faster than the person on the other end of the scope? Somewhere deeper in the ruined streets, another German marksman shifted to a new position, wondering who had just stolen his target. He would never know her name. Not yet. But the front had just gained a new hunter, and she had discovered she could do the one thing she'd come here to do. She settled in again, pressing her cheek to the stock, and began searching the broken skyline for the next small glint of glass. Before anyone called her a hunter, before bounties and rumors and stories, there had been lecture halls and notebooks and dust motes floating in warm light. The campus had smelled of paper and chalk, not cordite and smoke. She had been just another student sitting on a hard wooden bench, taking notes on trade routes and revolutions, believing that history was something already written, not something that could reach into your life and tear it apart in a single week. The shooting range behind the sports fields had always felt like an exception to that world. While other students walked in pairs discussing poetry or exam questions, she would slip away to the long row of targets, a borrowed rifle resting in the crook of her arm. At first, it was curiosity. Then it became something like meditation. The logic of it appealed to the same part of her that loved dates and timelines. You took a messy world and reduced it to clear lines, distance, position, a small circle at the far end that either acknowledged you or did not. The local youth shooting club coach had laughed when he saw her the first time, a slim girl with a stack of books under one arm and a rifle that looked almost too large for her. The laughter died when her first 5 shots landed close enough together to hide behind a single hand. "You like numbers?" he'd ask her once as they walked back from the targets, checking the tight cluster she'd just produced. "I like answers," she'd replied. Then the sirens started. The first raid on the city arrived not as a surprise attack, but as a kind of unwelcome proof that all the distant news from the front had been real. The thunder above, the concussive waves rolling through stone buildings, the pillars of smoke rising where lecture halls had stood, it all felt staged at first, like some grotesque reenactment staged atop the history she had been studying. Only the panic in people's voices, the way they stumbled over one another in the stairwells, made it clear this was no exercise. When the all-clear finally sounded and she fought her way back toward the campus, the air burned her throat. The courtyard where she'd once argued endlessly about old wars was now dotted with craters. Windows had vanished. One wing of the main building had simply uncoupled from reality. The library roof had collapsed inward, leaving shelves and pages and fragments of desks exposed to the sky. Her professor, the one who had stayed late after class to answer her extra questions, was carried out on a stretcher hours later, his face obscured. The friend who had always saved her a seat in the reading room never came down at all. Flames turned the scent of paper and ink into something sharp and final. The next morning, when she walked into the recruiting office, there was no drama to it. She stood in a line of faces that looked newly aged, held onto a worn identity card, and waited for someone behind a desk to tell her what the future would look like now. The officer glanced at her information, at her build, at the fact that she was a woman, and reached for the familiar paperwork. "Medical unit," he said. "We need capable people there." "I want to go to the front," she answered. He gave her a look he probably saved for every idealistic volunteer. "The front already has more than enough young people who think this will be an adventure. The wounded need care. That's where you can help." "I can shoot," she said. "So can many others," he replied, already turning to stamp the form. Her hand landed on the paper before the stamp did. "I have competition scores. Youth club. Provincial meets." She kept her voice level, fighting the urge to shout. "Test me. If I don't hit what you point at, send me to medical. If I do, give me what I'm asking for." He hesitated just long enough for her to see that this was not a conversation he had every day. The room smelled of wet wool and fatigue. Voices in the hall called out names and numbers. After a moment, he reached under the counter, placed a rifle on the table, and gestured toward the narrow window at the far end of the corridor. 100 meters, he said. The fence post with the chipped top. 5 rounds. No extra chances. She didn't bother to sit. She pressed the stock into her shoulder, felt the familiar weight settle, and let the corridor and its movement wash away until there was only the target, a faded sliver of wood in the distance. Her breathing slowed. The sounds around her receded. 5 shots cracked out in steady rhythm. She set the rifle down gently when she was done. An assistant walked outside. When he returned, he brought the fence post with him. The top was chewed into a tight, torn circle. The officer's eyes lingered on it for a long moment before he put the stamp away and pulled a different form from a stack. "Sniper training," he said quietly. "You'll report to the 25th Rifle Division. They'll decide what to do with you after that." He handed her the paper without further comment. She knew better than to smile. This was not a victory. It was an assignment, and it came with expectations that would fill the months ahead with more than numbers and paper targets. Training stripped the romance from the idea quickly. The instructors talked not about glory, but about endurance. About lying motionless for hours while insects investigated your face. About watching the same ruined skyline for an entire day to catch the single minute when a careless shape leaned out of cover. About moving slowly enough that grass bent around you without reacting. About memorizing the shapes of broken walls so that any new shadow stood out. They also talked about what would happen if you failed. Not to frighten, but to be honest. A missed shot didn't just mean one target untouched. It meant the other shooter, if he lived, would learn. He would become harder to find, quicker to hide, faster to punish your mistakes. Every duel was an exam you only got to take once. She finished the course near the top of her class. There were no speeches, no certificates, just an assignment and a train ticket. For months after walking into the recruiting office, she was climbing out of a transport near a battered Ukrainian town whose name she would always associate with dust, heat, and the way the air felt the first time she watched someone about to be taken from 300 meters away. The division she joined was already tired. Faces in the trenches had the grey look of people who had been awake for too many nights sharing too little food. They welcomed her not as a novelty, but as another pair of eyes with a rifle. On that first evening, as she sat sharing bread with the sergeant who had unknowingly become her first saved life, she listened to the way they spoke about the opposing marksmen. They weren't called snipers. They were called ghosts. Single shots that arrived out of nowhere, voices that vanished mid-sentence, helmets that toppled with no visible source. The unit had already lost 3 of its own shooters in a week. Each had followed the manual. Each had been careful. Each had been tracked, located, and silenced by someone on the other side of the ruined streets who knew exactly how they thought. As the sun went down that night, she lay awake in her shallow dugout, the manual's neat diagrams flickering in her mind. Concealment. Limited shots. Frequent relocation. All the rules that were supposed to keep her alive. The front would soon show her how fragile those rules were when the other side had read the same book and learned how to use it against them. For now, she listened to the distant rattle of small arms and the occasional heavier report of artillery. Above her, the sky had the same indifferent stars she'd seen from campus windows. Down here, the world had narrowed to a single question. Would she be able to apply what she'd learned when the target on the far end of the scope was looking for her too? The first time one of their own specialists did not return, it happened so quickly that Doctrine never had a chance to intervene. Lieutenant Morozova had been the one everyone watched during training walks. She moved through ruins the way water finds the easiest path, almost without sound, every step placed with unconscious precision. Her spotting notes were meticulous. She could glance at a street once and later sketch every collapsed balcony, every gap in a wall, every line of sight that might one day matter. She followed the manual as if it had been carved into stone. Never stay longer than 30 minutes in one hide. Never fire more than 3 rounds from the same position. Always have a secondary and tertiary exit in mind. Never allow yourself to be trapped in a structure with a single staircase. Never remain where the enemy expects you to be. On the morning she didn't make it back, the plan was simple. She would take a high position in a peeled open apartment block, using the broken concrete floors as natural firing platforms. From there, she had a clean line on a machine gun crew that had pinned down an entire platoon whenever they tried to move in daylight. The first report from her rifle came 20 minutes after she left. The machine gun went silent. Through binoculars, infantry observed 2 figures dropping where the weapon had been. She relocated downstairs, exactly as the manual prescribed, using a new angle to watch for replacement crews or officers. 20 minutes later, there was a second shot. Another figure slumped, the replacement leader removed before he could organize a new crew. By the timetable, she had done everything by the book. It was while she was moving to the ground floor position, stepping into the cover of a shadowed stairwell, that a single, sharp report reached the sector. The squad below heard her body hit the steps before they could process the direction of the shot. When they reached her, there was nothing to treat. The angle had been perfect. Someone on the other side had anticipated not only her firing location, but the path she was most likely to use as she followed the manual's relocation sequence. He had waited for the one moment every sniper is most vulnerable, while moving between 2 points they believe only they have chosen. Word came back later from reconnaissance. German units had assigned dedicated hunters whose task was not to engage infantry, but to observe Soviet marksmen, track their routines, and remove them. These counter-sniper specialists did not wait for chance encounters. They studied the way training produced predictable habits and exploited them. Her loss was filed in the daily reports as one line among many. But for the handful of shooters who had watched her work, it struck much deeper. If someone like Morozova, who followed every best practice, could be taken so suddenly, what did that say about the rest of them? A week later, another entry appeared in the casualty ledger. This one wasn't the result of a single carefully placed shot. It came from the sky. Corporal Stepanov had been proud of the shallow ditch he'd claimed as his hide. It curved just enough to conceal his outline, lined up neatly with a street of advance used by German patrols, and offered firm earth for a stable firing position. At dawn, he observed a small group of enemy troops moving cautiously between broken walls. 2 shots, 2 figures down. The rest scrambled for cover, disappearing into doorways and behind rubble. He waited, as trained, for movement that would give away a new position or a leader trying to regain control. Instead, he heard the growing whine of incoming shells. Someone across the line had done the same math he would have done in their place. The sniper was probably somewhere along the line connecting the point of impact and the direction from which the rounds had arrived. When artillery fell, it did not need to be precise. It only needed to be close. The ditch that had seemed so safe became a trap, its walls focusing the blast inward. When the barrage lifted, there was no one left there to relocate. Ludmila watched these patterns accumulate like case studies. Each loss was personal. A familiar face missing at evening roll call. Each was also, in the brutal logic of the battlefield, a data point. They died not because they were clumsy or careless, but because the other side understood the manual almost as well as they did and had begun to write its counterpoint. By the time autumn settled over Sevastopol's shattered suburbs, she could list the sequence from memory. A Soviet shooter finds a vantage point, fires on an opportunity, relocates along one of several predictable paths, and is punished by someone who has waited exactly for that textbook response. If artillery wasn't immediately available, a German marksman with a better angle would be. Soviet doctrine assumed that patience and concealment alone would keep snipers alive. It was a doctrine written for an enemy that acted impulsively, that blundered into traps. But the enemy she faced now was cautious and methodical, willing to leave gaps in the lines rather than risk exposing their own specialists. They watched. They listened. They learned. In quiet moments between missions, she found herself sketching not ruins, but arcs of vision. From here, what could be seen? From there, what angles overlapped? If she were on the other side, where would she sit to track a Soviet shooter trying to follow the manual? When she compared her imagined positions to the real locations from which their own had been lost, the matches were uncomfortable. She began to realize something fundamental. They were not just outshot. They were outthought. The Germans were acting, forcing responses, and her side was reacting, moving along grooves carved by doctrine. As long as that dynamic held, every duel would start with the Soviet marksman already at a disadvantage. The idea that would change everything arrived slowly, not as a flash of inspiration, but as a question that refused to leave her alone. What if the first person to be seen in an engagement was not the Soviet shooter, betrayed by the flash of a muzzle or a faint motion behind a window, but the German one? What if instead of hiding until discovered, she could compel the other side to reveal themselves first? The manual had no chapter on that. It taught how to disappear, how to endure, how to respond. It said nothing about seizing control of the encounter before the first shot. Yet every instinct in her told her that waiting quietly had turned her comrades into targets. If doing exactly what the book prescribed led to the same result, perhaps the problem was not the people, but the book itself. She kept the thought to herself at first. In an army that valued obedience, suggesting that doctrine was flawed was dangerous. Officers praised initiative on the battlefield, but not in the classroom where their own training had been defined. So she stayed silent, took her assignments, and continued to watch. The more she observed, The clearer one thing became, German marksmen, for all their skill, shared certain habits too. They preferred height. They favored positions with a wide view and an easy retreat. They took pride in clean, distant shots, in single reports that ended an encounter before anyone could answer. They expected fear. They expected the other side to hug the ground. What they did not expect, she suspected, was someone willing to stand in the one place everyone agreed was impossible, in the open, on purpose, daring them to take the shot. The idea was reckless. It ran against everything she had been taught. It would require not only courage, but cold timing and precise knowledge of where her own rifle needed to be waiting. Still, the image would not leave her. A fake silhouette in a window, a helmet where no sane head would appear, and her, somewhere else, watching for the moment the enemy accepted the invitation. If it worked, she would control the opening move. If it failed, she would add her own name to the list of those who had believed their skill could outweigh the mathematics of combat. The next step was no longer theoretical. At some point, the idea would need to be tested on Raelle Stone, under real fire, against someone who had spent as much time thinking about this game as she had. She waited for the right sector, the right problem, the right ghost to call out of hiding. The chance came in a district that had once held schools and small shops and was now mainly piles of bricks separated by strips of open ground no one wanted to cross. A German marksman had been working that area for several days, removing not random soldiers, but specific ones, officers moving between command posts, radio operators, squad leaders. He favored the early hours when routines were most predictable and nerves at their thinnest. By the time she was called to the sector, the unit there was frayed. Orders were relayed underground, faces that should have been familiar to the soldiers changed almost daily, and any movement above waist height during certain hours felt like stepping onto a marked stage. When she arrived at their temporary command dugout, the captain in charge looked less like someone asking for help and more like someone clutching at his last option. "He's not just a good shot," the captain said, pointing to a rough map spread across an ammunition crate. "He understands how we move. Every time we adjust our route, he's already watching the new path. We've tried guessing his position from the entry angles, but he never fires from the same place twice." The map was a mess of arrows and notes. Each fallen soldier had a small mark where they'd been hit, along with an arrow indicating the approximate direction of the shot. Taken individually, the marks looked random. Together, traced carefully with a pencil, they formed a loose ring. "He's staying outside this line," she murmured, drawing a faint circle that touched the outermost arrows. "Far enough back to have options, close enough to see faces. Smart." The captain rubbed his eyes. "We've already lost more people trying to find him. We can't afford to keep playing his game." "Then we stop playing his game," she said quietly. "We make him play ours." That night, she walked the perimeter of the circle with a reconnaissance officer who knew the area's ruins like old friends. They moved by touch and memory more than sight, stepping over collapsed beams, feeling along crater edges, pausing often to listen. The officer pointed out building remnants that offered good views, choke points where movement was almost unavoidable, and the few spots German patrols tended to avoid. She marked mental notes. Here, a third-floor balcony still clinging stubbornly to a wall, giving a clean view of the command post. There, a gap between two burnt-out structures where an officer crossing at dawn could be easily observed. And over there, a damaged bell tower whose upper levels commanded almost the entire sector. By the time first light tinged the horizon the following morning, she had chosen her layout. The plan violated multiple lines from the manual. It involved a deliberate silhouette, a decoy placed in a position the enemy would be watching, and her own body lying in a less comfortable but more secure hide just far enough away that no one would associate the two at a glance. She entered the ruin 2 hours before the usual pattern of attacks began, carrying not just a rifle but a bundle of fabric and a spare helmet. The building had once housed officers. Now its walls were a jagged outline against the sky, the floors half missing. She climbed carefully to a spot where a partial wall remained, facing toward the area where officers normally crossed. At that spot, she propped the helmet and coat so they would form the suggestion of a figure leaning slightly forward, as if observing the line. From a distance, through another scope, the shape would read as exactly what it imitated, someone of rank making the same mistake his predecessors had made. Her own position was 5 meters away and a full meter lower, tucked behind what had once been an interior partition. From there, she could see not only the decoy but also the most likely enemy vantage points she and the recon officer had identified the night before. The key was the angle. The German marksman needed to have a clear shot at the decoy while leaving himself just exposed enough that a careful observer could find the shadow of his hide. She lay down, adjusted the sling on her rifle until it supported the weight perfectly, and settled into the kind of stillness that made fingers tingle. Time stretched. The decoy figure stood motionless in the grey light, a quiet dare to anyone watching. Minutes passed. The city breathed in shallow bursts, distant artillery, a burst of machine gun fire somewhere else along the line, the occasional shout carried on the wind. Below, Soviet soldiers moved with deliberate caution, hugging cover, avoiding the open area near the command post where so many had been lost. No officer stepped into the open. She had made sure of that, insisting that for one morning, they remain under cover. The first hint of motion came just after dawn fully broke. On the far side of the ruined street, high in the shattered remains of a house, a darker rectangle shifted almost imperceptibly. If she hadn't been focused there already, she might have missed it. A fragment of fabric, a shoulder easing into position, the faintest reflection from glass. Her heart rate did not spike. Training kept her breath even, her hands quiet. Let him settle, she told herself. Let him believe the target is his. The shot, when it came, was as clean and sharp as the others had described. The helmet jerked, then flipped backward, rolling with a clatter that sent dust into the air. Below, a few soldiers flinched, instinct driving them deeper into cover, though none of them had been visible. Only the decoy had stood in the open. In the instant after the shot, she watched the enemy hide. The recoil had shifted him slightly, just enough for his outline to emerge fully from the mass of broken brick. She had prepared herself for a window of 2 or 3 seconds. In reality, she had slightly less. He was good. The moment the shot landed, he began to pull back. Her crosshairs reached the spot where his torso had been just as he moved. Rather than chase the full body, she anticipated his retreat, aimed where his shoulder would pass through the narrow gap. Years of target practice merged with months of observing real movement. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle spoke. In the scope, she saw his shape twist sideways abruptly. Then he dropped out of sight. She did not stay to admire the result. The trap's value ended the moment she fired. She slid backward, keeping low, and began the pre-planned route to a different building 2 rows behind. Only when she had settled into a new hide facing the old enemy position did she allow herself to search again. Minutes later, she saw movement near the enemy hide. 2 figures crawled cautiously toward the spot where the marksman had been. One reached out, tugged something, then beckoned the other. Together, they dragged a limp shape back behind cover. The rifle, a long-barreled weapon with a scope that caught the light, glinted briefly before vanishing. She exhaled slowly. It wasn't joy that washed through her. It was something quieter. Confirmation. The method could work. She had forced a hunter to reveal himself by giving him exactly the kind of target he loved, an exposed leader, and then punished that decision. Over the next days, she repeated variations of the same trick in different sectors. Each time, the details changed. Sometimes the decoy stood, sometimes it lay as if resting on a parapet, sometimes it appeared briefly and then withdrew, as if an impatient officer had come to check the line and retreated. Each time, she lay elsewhere, at a slightly unexpected angle, watching the likely German positions instead of the space in front of the decoy. Some engagements ended quickly, with a single return shot and a confirmed removal later. Others stretched for hours, the enemy more cautious, waiting to see if the apparent target would move again. In those cases, she learned to wait even longer, to let boredom and curiosity do part of the work. Eventually, even skilled marksmen became tempted when a silhouette remained in the same spot for too long. Word of her successes drifted through the trenches not as statistics, but as stories told over ration tins. There was a woman, they said, who lured German snipers into shooting at emptiness and then removed them with 1 round. Units started asking for her by name when a ghost plagued their sector. She did not correct anyone when they exaggerated. Exaggeration bred caution in the enemy. The more the Germans believed in a phantom woman who could see them when they fired, the more hesitant they became. Hesitation saved lives even before the shot was fired. Of course, the enemy adapted too. Skilled hunters on the other side began to notice that some too perfect targets did not behave quite right. They waited longer, refused to take the first apparent opportunity, tested with small distractions. But in adapting, they gave up part of their edge. Every second they spent analyzing illusions was a second they were not exploiting real openings. It was in this shifting contest that her kill count began to climb. Each engagement was another equation solved, another mind on the other side of the scope-out thought. The numbers would later become famous. At the time, they were just marks in a small notebook she kept close, each line a blend of necessity and memory. What mattered more to her than the total was something she couldn't write down, the feeling that, at least in one small corner of the conflict, she had stopped simply enduring the enemy strategy and started rewriting the terms of the duel. The more she worked, the more the pattern of the opposing specialists revealed itself. They were not interchangeable shadows. Each had preferences. One favored shots from the left, another liked to work from positions that gave a narrow but very deep field of view, trading width for distance. Some took bolder risks, changing angles frequently within a single morning. Others were so methodical that once she identified their chosen height, she could predict the exact floor they would occupy in a similar building. She treated them like case studies in an advanced seminar that only she attended. After each encounter, she reconstructed the sequence from both sides, asking herself what she would have done if she had been the one across the line. Sometimes, the answer was reassuringly similar. Other times, she found that the enemy had surprised her, and she added those surprises to a mental library of possibilities. One engagement in particular sharpened her understanding of how far the contest had evolved. The target was not simply a dangerous marksman. He was systematically dismantling the command structure of a neighboring regiment. In 3 days, he had removed an operations officer, 2 senior sergeants, and the sole experienced radio operator responsible for coordinating artillery support. He struck only during a narrow window just after dawn, when new orders were moving along the line and leaders had to leave cover to confer and adjust. When she arrived, the tension in the dugout was nearly tangible. Junior officers spoke in whispers, glancing upward as if the marksman could somehow hear them underground. The commander slid a sheet of paper toward her with locations marked in red pencil. "These are the points where he struck," he said softly. "Always between 5:40 and 7:20. Always one shot. No second chances. We tried sending runners instead of officers. He removed the runners. We tried changing the time of briefings. He shifted with us." The marks on the map formed no neat circle this time. Instead, they described a slightly irregular crescent. The angles of impact, estimated by desperate men after the fact, converged on a cluster of ruins that had once been a school, a small church, and a row of taller apartment blocks. She went to see the field herself. Standing in the pre-dawn gloom, she imagined the scene the way the enemy must have seen it. Officers emerging under pressure, pausing briefly at the same corners they had used yesterday because habits run deep, leaning close to whisper to subordinates. Each of those moments opened a small, predictable gap in their cover. The logical thing for a cautious marksman to do was to keep moving between several positions to avoid being patterned. But moving also risked exposure. So where would she go if she wanted the widest set of angles with the smallest number of hide changes? Her eyes climbed naturally to the damaged tower of the small church and the top floor of the former school. From these heights, a patient shooter could see most of the approach routes without needing to rush. The bell tower, especially, offered near total oversight. It would also be a magnet for counterfire once the enemy guessed its use. The school's upper floor, by contrast, had a partially collapsed roof, leaving a low ridge of masonry that could conceal a rifle barrel while leaving the shooter's body deeper in shadow. She suspected he alternated between the two, but favored the safer building more often than not. That would be where she'd wait for him. Her plan that morning was bolder than her earlier decoy experiments. The manual would have called it unacceptable. She didn't just intend to lure a shot at a passive silhouette. She intended to step into the role of bait herself. She arranged it carefully. The officers agreed, reluctantly, to remain underground during the critical window. In their place, she borrowed an overcoat and cap with insignia still visible and hung them on a hook near the entrance to the main command dugout so they would be seen from a distance. Then she selected a position not far from that entrance, in plain sight, where an officer might plausibly stand to confer with a runner. Her rifle, however, did not stay with her. She positioned it several meters away, behind the broken lip of a crater, angled upward toward the school's demolished roofline. The distance was short, but the path was awkward. She would have to throw herself toward it, slide into position, and bring the scope to her eye in a motion smooth enough that it wouldn't catch on debris. She spent nearly an hour rehearsing that motion in the dark, timing how long it took her to move from standing in the open to lying behind the rifle ready to fire. Each time she shaved off fractions of a second, adjusting where she placed her boots, how she bent her knees, where her hands landed. By the time the sky began to lighten, She had it down to something a clock would measure as barely 2 seconds. It still felt like an eternity. When she stepped into the open, coat buttoned, cap at an angle any observer would recognize, every instinct screamed at her to duck. The square in front of the dugout looked suddenly enormous, a patch of ground that might as well have been painted with a target. She forced her hands to remain at her sides, talking quietly with a runner who knew his part in the performance. Move lips, point occasionally, make the scene look natural. The minutes crawled. The runner's words blurred. Her awareness narrowed to a horizontal slice of the city in front of her and a tight line between her shoulder blades where she imagined a distant pair of crosshairs resting. The urge to glance up at the ruins, to try to spot her unseen opponent, was almost overpowering, but she resisted. Real officers didn't scan the skyline when speaking to subordinates. They trusted their surroundings. She had to look as real as possible. The shot, when it came, was as close as a breath. She heard the report, a slightly different tone from the rifles on her own side, and in the same instant felt the air beside her head twist. The bullet passed so near that she later found a single strand of hair sheared shorter than the rest. Her body had already started to move before conscious thought caught up. She dropped left, not backward, diving toward the crater lip where her rifle waited. The runner instinctively went flat in the opposite direction, training taking over. Gravel bit into her palms as she slid. Her hands found the stock exactly where she'd planned. The scope rose to her eye as if pulled by a string. The world inside the circle of glass snapped into focus. The rooftop of the school building loomed larger, already framed. Along the broken ridge, she caught the briefest glimpse of a figure pulling back from a narrow firing slit, the barrel of his weapon still angled from a shot he'd just taken. He was fast. He'd already realized something was wrong. His target had moved not like someone struck, but like someone expecting the round. She did not have time for careful calculations. The distance was roughly known from her night survey. The wind was negligible in the still morning air. She aimed not where he was, but where his torso would pass as he retreated deeper behind the masonry. Her finger tightened. The recoil jolted through her. In the fraction of a second before the figure disappeared entirely, she saw his upper body twist abruptly and then drop out of view. She stayed down this time, breathing hard, waiting. No second shot came from that rooftop. No movement disturbed the broken edge. Only several long minutes later did a squad of Soviet infantry, pre-briefed and ready, move cautiously toward the structure. When they reached the upper floor, they found a man lying near the firing slit, his customized rifle still within reach. His logbook contained careful entries, distances, locations, times, tallies. The count was high. He had shaped the battlefield for days. Now his page had simply stopped. When they told her, she didn't ask for the number. She already knew it would be more than she wanted to carry in her head. What mattered to her was that the lines on the map around that command post would no longer gain new red marks in the same pattern. The story of that duel spread quickly. Some said she had stood in the open for an hour. Others claimed the enemy had fired twice and she had dodged both. None of that was true, but the core fact, she had used herself as bait and survived, was enough to feed rumor. On the German side, reports filtered back that a troublesome Soviet sniper in the sector was using dangerous and unpredictable tactics. At first, they dismissed these stories as exaggerations. Then casualty reports among their own specialists began to mount, and the tone shifted. Someone across the line had stopped playing by the rules they expected. Her reputation, without her consent, started to grow. By the time winter crept into the shattered streets, she had accumulated far more than isolated victories. Her ledger, checked and rechecked by officers who needed proof for every claim, listed over 70 confirmed eliminations, many of them enemy marksmen. Among the rank and file, the numbers morphed into legends. Some said she could see through walls. Others swore she never missed. She knew better. She could list every shot that hadn't gone exactly where she wanted, every narrow escape where an enemy round had passed uncomfortably close, every decision that could have ended differently if the wind had shifted or if she had been half a second slower. The front had no patience for myth. It had a lot of time for results. Her approach evolved with experience. At first, she had relied on simple decoys, a helmet, a coat, a silhouette. As German specialists grew warier, she adapted. She began to mimic the small gestures of life that made a target believable. A figure that appeared briefly, leaned on a parapet as if tired, disappeared, then returned 5 minutes later for a second, slightly different glance. An arm that moved in sync with distant speech. a glint of metal that could have been a belt buckle or a map case. Often, she used real people, but in carefully controlled ways. She would brief an officer or a runner on where to stand, how long to remain, when to step back. Meanwhile, she lay offset, searching not for movement in front of the decoy, but for motion behind enemy lines. She also learned to think in terms of zones rather than pins. Early in her work, she had tried to pinpoint a single stone or window as the likely enemy hide. Now she marked entire regions. If a shot came at this angle, from that distance, and at that time of day, it must originate somewhere within this wedge of buildings. Her job then was to narrow the wedge before she risked a trap. To do that, she and a growing circle of reconnaissance officers developed their own informal language. A broken chimney here meant a block line of sight. A toppled tram there created a blind spot German snipers might avoid because they couldn't see past it. A tree stripped of branches along one side suggested repeated muzzle blast from that direction. By combining these clues, she could often predict not just that a marksman was present, but which ruined stairwell he was likely to choose. The enemy, for their part, did not remain static. German sniper schools had produced professionals who obeyed their own manuals, but necessity began to bend those rules. Some specialists started to fire from ground-level hides, aware that Soviet counterfire now expected them higher. Others rotated between very different types of positions, complicating any attempt to pattern them. In this chess match, she decided to introduce psychology more deliberately. She began leaving small tokens behind where German specialists might be found, once the area was secure and the danger passed. A piece of red ribbon tied to a stair rail. A playing card tucked between bricks near the firing slit. A single cartridge case polished to a shine and placed beside an abandoned rifle. Her own superiors frowned at this at first. It seemed frivolous, a waste of precious energy on symbols. But the message was not intended for them. It was for the enemy. Stories travel in every army. German units started telling one another about a Soviet shooter who not only removed their best marksman but tagged the scenes afterward, as if signing a painting. The act suggested confidence bordering on arrogance. She could approach the very sites where the duel had taken place and still leave in one piece. Fear is a strange force at the front. It doesn't always show as panic. Sometimes it appears as caution that verges on paralysis. German hunters, once bold, now lingered longer before taking shots, double-checked their surroundings, hesitated when presented with apparently easy targets. In those extra seconds, Soviet officers moved out of view, runners completed their crossings, and opportunities were lost. Every nervous pause contributed to the softening of the enemy's edge. For a sniper, the first shot often determines who owns the engagement. If the enemy hesitates, that advantage can shift. Within her own forces, she noticed a different kind of change. Soldiers who had once seen the battlefield as entirely hostile began to reclaim small pieces of confidence. When they heard that a dangerous enemy specialist had been neutralized, they stepped a little more firmly, raised their heads slightly higher when moving between covers. They still respected the threat, but they no longer saw it as omnipotent. Not all missions were duels with other marksmen. Much of her work focused on removing people whose decisions shaped the fight. Officers pointing, artillery spotters signaling, machine gun crews anchoring lines. She prioritized these targets not because they were easier, but because each one removed changed the way an entire enemy group behaved. On one particularly cold morning, she spent nearly 6 hours in the same narrow recess of rubble, watching an intersection where carts and messengers periodically appeared. A German officer there had been directing the placement of small mortars that harassed her comrades' trenches with uncanny accuracy. The man never carried a weapon larger than a pistol, but his gestures sent shells into places where they did the most harm. She watched him send a runner to the left, then to the right, always with the same quick flick of the hand. She learned his posture when he was merely talking and the slightly straighter line of his shoulders when he was giving an order. Only when she was certain she could distinguish between the two did she act. When her shot landed and he dropped, the mortars fell strangely silent. The crews, lacking someone to integrate their work with the broader battle, fired more sporadically. Within hours, their positions had been located and suppressed by counterfire. One man's absence rippled outward. She did not record his rank in her notebook that night. She only marked the time, the conditions, and the effect. The pattern reinforced what she already understood. Numbers alone didn't define the value of her work. The choice of targets mattered just as much. Her own body paid for this pace. The cold, stiffened joints kept too long in one position. Eyes trained from hours behind a scope left her seeing faint circles even when she closed her lids. More than once, she returned from a mission to find that she had no appetite left for the thin stew in her mess tin. The first time shrapnel found her, it was not during a dramatic duel, but while she was relocating between two positions after a night of careful watching. Artillery began suddenly, without the usual build-up. A shell landed close enough to lift her off her feet, hurling dust and fragments. She felt a hot sting along her arm and shoulder, then a spreading numbness. The medics cleaned shallow wounds, removed small metal slivers, wrapped her in bandages that smelled faintly of alcohol and smoke. She spent one night in a crowded aid station listening to the breathing and muttering of other injured soldiers. In the morning, when they offered to transfer her farther to the rear, she refused. The injuries were not deep. More importantly, she could not shake the feeling that if she stopped now, even for a few weeks, the strange fragile equilibrium she had helped create at the front might tilt back the other way. She went back to work, rapt, sore, and perhaps more careful with her routes, but no less determined to keep forcing the duels on her own terms. Outside her immediate world of ruins and targets, her name had begun to travel further than she knew. Reports of her tally moved up chains of command, through staff offices where officials underlined numbers in red and debated how best to use such a figure for morale. They would make decisions soon that would pull her life in an entirely new direction. For the moment, she remained where she felt she belonged, lying in the dust, eyes behind glass, waiting for the brief instant when calculation and courage met. By early spring, the figures in the reports had become impossible for even the most skeptical staff officer to ignore. 309 confirmed eliminations. 36 of those trained enemy marksmen. A large proportion of the remainder officers, non-commissioned leaders, and specialists whose absence had shaped engagements in ways that weren't easily summarized in a single column. The numbers came with witnesses, squad leaders who'd seen the effect of her work on their sectors, artillery officers who'd watched enemy observation posts fall suddenly silent, infantrymen who had crossed formerly lethal streets under her unseen protection. Confirmation procedures were strict. Claims were cross-checked against recovered documents and battlefield observations. When the final tally was presented, it was not a propaganda invention. It was a ledger of hard, unglamorous work. Alongside the figures, another set of observations moved through headquarters. Notes on her methods. Commanders had begun to notice that wherever she operated, enemy specialists disappeared faster than elsewhere. A pattern emerged in briefing papers, utilizes dual position techniques, employs decoys and deliberate exposure to draw fire, highly effective in counter-sniper role. Spurred by these reports, training departments requested detailed accounts of her tactics. They wanted to know not just that she was successful, but how. Instructors interviewed soldiers who had seen her prepare traps, recon officers who had walked sectors with her, and young snipers who had accompanied her on operations. From these fragments, a new set of lessons began to take shape. Future classes would learn not only how to hide and wait, but how to provoke and punish. The manual that had once preached pure concealment started to gain paragraphs about initiative, about using illusions to force the enemy into revealing themselves, about the value of understanding an opponent's habits. She was largely unaware of this doctrinal evolution. Her days still revolved around the simple questions. Where is he? What can he see? What will he do if I show him this? But the institutional machine around her had already decided that she was more than an individual asset. She was also a symbol, and symbols could be used in ways individual soldiers could not. The decision to remove her from the line came after yet another brush with the randomness of artillery. She was moving between positions, shifting along a trench that had once been a tram track, when a shell burst close enough that the world went white and sound turned into an all-encompassing roar. When she came back to herself, her face was hot and wet. Vision blurred on one side. Her jaw throbbed with a deep, bone-deep ache. Medics worked fast, hands steady despite the conditions. They stemmed bleeding, cleaned the wound, bandaged her head and face. In deeper facilities behind the line, surgeons did what they could to preserve her sight and repair fractured bone. She drifted in and out of awareness, catching only phrases. Lucky it wasn't closer. We may save the eye. She should not go back to the same sector. When she was finally stable enough to hold a conversation, a senior officer visited her cot. He did not come alone. Staff assistants trailed behind like shadows. You've done your part at the front, he said, voice formal. More than your part. The country knows your name now. It's time to use that in a different way. She frowned, the motion tugging at stitches. My skills are here, she managed. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. On the line. There are others who can give speeches. The officer shook his head. We have many good shooters. We have far fewer people whose stories can rally a nation and impress our allies. You've proven what a single determined soldier can do. Now we need you to show the world that even our women stand and fight this way. The phrase made her skin prickle. She had never thought of herself as a demonstration. She had simply refused to accept being told where she didn't belong. But the weight of the order was clear. It was not a request. High Command had decided. In the months that followed, she found herself in a strange new theater. The ruins of Sevastopol and Odessa were replaced by polished floors and heavy curtains. She stood on platforms instead of rooftops, facing crowds instead of a single distant figure. Where once she had spoken in brief, practical bursts about fields of fire and wind, now she answered questions about courage, about fear, about what it meant to take hundreds of lives in the name of defense. In Moscow, party officials introduced her with phrases like the terror of the occupiers and our nation's deadliest markswoman. Awards were pinned to her uniform. Medals shone where dust and scratches had once lived. She accepted them because to refuse would have been to insult the people whose trust she carried, but a part of her felt detached from the glitter. The front was distant. Her comrades were still there. She was here, far from the sound of rifles, talking into microphones. Her travels extended beyond her own country. In Britain, leaders shook her hand and asked quietly whether the stories of her count were true. In the United States, crowds packed halls to catch a glimpse of the small, serious woman in a foreign uniform. Journalists asked questions that mixed fascination with doubt. 309, one American reporter asked. That's a lot of people. She answered with the same flat honesty she used on the range. It is 309 fewer opponents firing at our soldiers and families, she said. I did not choose the numbers. I chose to do my duty whenever I had the chance. Some listeners saw in her a symbol of national resilience. Others saw a challenge to their own assumptions about what women could do in uniform. Young women approached her after events, eyes bright, asking whether she had been afraid, whether she had ever hesitated. She told them the truth. Fear existed every day, but it did not control her choices. Hesitation was something she could not afford when someone else's life depended on her speed. One of the few people with whom she felt an easy connection during those tours was a prominent political spouse who had long advocated for women's rights. This woman looked past the numbers and saw the human being underneath. You've carried more than most, she said privately over tea. Not just in what you've done, but in what people now expect you to represent. It was easier when all I had to do was find one person at a time, Ludmila replied. Now I feel like I'm carrying entire expectations into every room. It's the same skill, in a way, the older woman said thoughtfully. You learned to see clearly through chaos. Do that here too. Speak honestly. The rest is noise. When the tour ended and she returned home, the front had shifted. The cities whose roofs she had crawled across were in different hands now. The line had moved westward. Her former units were scattered, many of her comrades gone, some to resting places they'd never return from, others to new commands. High Command decided that her place from then on would be in classrooms and training fields rather than forward ruins. If she could not safely return to the line, she could at least ensure that others carried refined versions of her methods. It was, in its way, another front. She accepted the assignment with mixed feelings. Part of her still longed for the clarity of the scope. Another part, one that had watched too many friends vanish, knew that the chance to pass on lessons instead of adding one more line to the casualty list was rare. The questions her students asked were practical. How close should a decoy be to your real position? How many seconds do you usually have between enemy shot and your response? How do you control your breathing when the first bullet almost touches you? She answered them all, not as a legend, but as a practitioner who had made mistakes and survived them. She spoke of the importance of studying the enemy's habits, of never assuming they were foolish, of thinking not just about where they were but about what they wanted from each interaction. She taught them to see their work not as isolated shots, but as part of a larger struggle over initiative. Her own days of crawling through shattered stone with a rifle were over. But through the men and women she trained, her crazy idea of using exposure as a weapon instead of a weakness began to spread across an entire army. The war moved on. The line crept westward, then surged, then rolled over places that had once seemed unattainable. Cities whose names had been whispered as distant goals became locations in training diagrams. New battles arose in forests, plains, and towns whose houses still smelled of fresh paint instead of burnt plaster. Her role kept her mostly behind those lines now, in camps where new recruits cycled through by the hundreds. Many had grown up hearing about what had happened at Sevastopol and Odessa. Some had read articles about a nameless lady of the scope, without realizing they were sitting across from her at a folding table piled with notebooks and field glasses. She did not correct them when they spoke in abstractions. If someone eventually connected the stories to the quiet instructor who insisted on extra hours of observation drills, they were usually more surprised by how ordinary she seemed than by the fact that the legend had been a real person. In those classes, she emphasized the difference between imitation and understanding. It would have been easy for students to copy the surface details of her tactics, decoys, dual hides, deliberate exposure, without grasping the thinking behind them. She made sure they knew that the core was not the trick itself, but the mindset that created it. "You can't copy my situations," she told them. "Your enemy will know the stories by now. They will be waiting for some of the same things. You must ask yourselves the same question I did. What does the opponent expect me to do, and where can I safely break those expectations?" She walked them through her early failures as well as her successes. She described the times when she had guessed wrong about where an enemy might hide and had to abandon a trap with nothing to show for hours of preparation. She explained how, in some sectors, German snipers simply refused to take the bait at all, forcing her to change focus to other targets and wait for new patterns. In doing so, she extended her influence beyond her own experiences. Her students began developing their own variations. Some experimented with sound decoys, small noises meant to mimic careless movements in one direction while the real position waited elsewhere. Others used the occasional flash of a mirror or the clatter of dropped equipment to draw attention while they watched for reactions. Reports from the front started to contain unfamiliar phrases. Student of the Odessa method, used Pavlichenko-style baiting in this sector, applied dual-hide tactics to forest terrain. She flinched whenever she saw her name attached to something she hadn't personally devised, but she also understood that this was how ideas grew. Once released into the world, they belonged to anyone who needed them. In staff rooms and academies far from the trenches, officers compiled lessons from the war. They turned bloody, chaotic months into diagrams and principles, trying to distill what had worked and why. Among the many conclusions, one kept resurfacing, that specialized shooters who treated their work as a dynamic contest of minds, not just eyes and trigger fingers, were far more effective than those who simply sought a good hide and waited. Her example became a case study, sometimes named, sometimes anonymized, of that approach. Training manuals revised in the mid-war years contained sections on deceptive tactics, aggressive counter-sniper operations, and psychological pressure. Where once the emphasis had been on becoming invisible, there were now passages about creating illusions. Beyond her own army, Allied observers took note as well. Officers from other nations, visiting training camps and battlefields to learn from each other, wrote reports on how Soviet snipers operated. They recorded the use of decoys to flush out German marksmen, the boldness of certain practitioners in exposing themselves for brief, calculated moments, and the results those tactics produced. Names were often lost in translation. Her specific contributions became part of a collective Eastern Front experience. In later decades, instructors in faraway schools would teach methods remarkably similar to hers, citing lessons from urban warfare in the 1940s, without realizing that many of those lessons traced back to one young woman lying behind rubble in a Ukrainian town. For her personally, the war ended not with a final dramatic duel, but with a slow easing of tension in training halls. The urgent flow of new recruits slowed. Students began to ask questions not about the current campaign, but about what would come after. Some wanted to stay in the military. Others dreamed of professions that had nothing to do with scopes and rifles. She thought often about returning to university. The buildings she had known were gone, but new ones would rise. History had not ended. It had simply taken a path that her younger self could never have imagined she would walk within it. The idea of sitting once more in a lecture about past conflicts, knowing how they felt from the inside, held a strange appeal. Yet she also knew that there was no simple way to go back. The person who had once scribbled notes about treaties in a paper notebook was not the same as the one who now carried images of 309 faces in her memory. Each had been seen for a moment through glass, aligned with a crosshair, reduced to an angle and a breath. She told her students that she treated it as mathematics. That was true in the moment of action. Afterward, numbers and equations had a way of turning into weight. In quieter hours, she thought not of counts, but of individual scenes. The sergeant who had shared his bread. The officer whose hand movements had called down mortars until they stopped forever. The German specialist whose logbook had ended mid-page when her shot found him in a bell tower. The opposing hunters whose patience and skill had nearly matched her own. She wondered sometimes how many of them had also thought they were solving equations in service of something larger than themselves. In that sense, they had all been studying different sides of the same harsh subject. The state honored her formally, of course. Ceremonies with brass bands, citations for courage, the highest medals pinned carefully on her uniform. Newspapers ran photographs of her in dress attire, hair neatly arranged, bearing the expression of someone who had learned not to let her inner life show too easily on her face. Children in schools learned her name alongside dates of major battles. Writers crafted plays and articles that smoothed the rough edges of her story into something more linear and inspiring. She accepted the public version of herself with the same resigned discipline with which she had accepted orders years earlier. It served a purpose, to remind people that it was possible to stand firm when everything around you was falling apart. The fact that the reality underneath was messier, full of doubt and fatigue and small, private griefs, did not make the symbol false, it just made it incomplete. In the years after the conflict, as peace settled unevenly across scarred landscapes, she built a more ordinary life. She married, worked, raised a child, waited in queues, tended small joys and frustrations like anyone else. Those around her learned that she was often reserved, sometimes sharp, occasionally unexpectedly gentle. A very few knew details of what she had done. Most saw only the outline: veteran, decorated, a person you didn't lightly argue with about perseverance. Her health carried quiet reminders of a past. Old wounds ached in damp weather. Her vision in one eye, though saved, never returned fully to its former clarity. Loud sudden sounds could send a quick flash of tension through her muscles before she consciously relaxed. She did not dramatize these things. When asked, she shrugged them off as the natural cost of having lived through extraordinary times. As the conflict receded into textbooks and memorial days, journalists and historians sometimes sought her out. Some wanted to confirm numbers. Others were more interested in feelings. They asked whether she regretted anything, whether she had nightmares, whether she would choose the same path again if given the chance. She answered in simple, honest terms. She regretted the need for any of it. She sometimes woke with images she'd rather not see. And yes, if a city were threatened again and her skills were needed, she would walk the same path, because the alternative, doing nothing while others defended what she loved, felt impossible to her. The world outside her country interpreted her story in ways that often had more to do with their own debates than with her actual life. Advocates for women in uniform held her up as proof of capability. Skeptics questioned the tally, seeing in it an uncomfortable challenge to their notions of who could be both nurturing and lethal. Military strategists used her engagements as case studies in the importance of adaptability. Through all of it, she remained quietly consistent in one message: that survival in such conditions had less to do with any single crazy trick than with the willingness to reconsider assumptions when those assumptions were clearly costing lives. In the decades that followed, as new conflicts erupted in other corners of the world, the ideas that had shaped her work continued to echo in places she had never seen. On training ranges continents away, instructors explained to future snipers that concealment was not a static concept. They spoke of controlling the engagement, of using decoys, of provoking enemy shooters into revealing themselves. Slides showed diagrams of dual hides, of bait positions and real positions offset by a few crucial meters. The origin stories attached to these lessons varied. Some credited anonymous veterans from the Eastern Front. Others referenced generalized doctrine updates from the mid-20th century. A few mentioned a woman by name, but usually as a curiosity rather than as a primary source. Modern technology layered new tools onto old principles. Thermal scopes could see heat where once only careful eyes could detect movement. Electronic sensors could triangulate shots faster than any human could. Yet, even in this advanced environment, the basic logic she had used remained valid. Decoys evolved into inflatable silhouettes, heat-emitting mannequins, or remote control devices that mimicked human movement. These tools attracted not crows in a wheat field or German snipers in a bell tower, but insurgents, hidden shooters in city alleys, any adversary who still relied on the human instinct to fire at the first plausible target. Instructors emphasized that the equipment might change, but the mental game did not. The side that could force the other to act second, to respond rather than initiate, still held a crucial edge. Occasionally, a younger sniper studying historical case files would stumble across a story in more detail, perhaps in a dusty monograph, perhaps in a translated memoir. They would find not just the headline numbers, but the careful reconstruction of one particular day when a young woman had stood in the open for 17 long minutes, trusting her preparation enough to survive being the bait. Some of them would recognize in that account the same emotions they had felt: the tightening of the chest when stepping into a risky position, the strange calm that sometimes settles in once the decision is made, the way the world narrows to a small circle of glass and a rhythm of breath. Not all of them knew that the helmet trick used by their own units, the mannequin on a stick raised briefly above a wall to draw fire, had roots in a farm boy's crow hunting in one theater and a student's counter-sniper experiments in another. Ideas in war often grow tangled like that, branches from different trees woven into a single canopy. What united these disparate strands was not nationality or gender, but a shared refusal to accept that existing doctrine was enough. Whenever soldiers realized that following the manual led predictably to losses, someone, somewhere, asked whether a different approach was possible. Sometimes the answer was foolish and costly. Sometimes it changed the way the next generation would fight. Back in her home country, her name passed through several phases. Immediately after the war, she was held up as a pure symbol, the quiet student turned legendary defender. Later, scholars re-examined records, adding nuance, correcting exaggerations, exploring the context of her actions. In some eras, she was emphasized as a patriotic model. In others, she was celebrated primarily as a woman who had broken into what had been a male domain. Through these shifting interpretations, the core facts of her service remained the same. At a large military museum in the capital, under glass that reflected the overhead lights, lay the rifle she had carried. Visitors walked by, reading the plaque, her name, her rank, the phrase 309 confirmed eliminations. Few of them knew the details of how she had accomplished so many of those, or that a surprising number had involved putting herself closer to harm, not farther from it. Those who lingered sometimes noticed scratches on the rifle stock, marks where hands had tightened in cold, where the wood had knocked against stone. The metal around the bolt had the polished look that comes only from long use. The scope bore tiny adjustments that told a patient the story of someone who had cared enough to tune and retune for precision. In another display, across the hall, an exhibit on sniper tactics contained a small diagram. It showed two positions, side by side, one marked bait, the other shooter. An arrow indicated the path of an enemy shot to the bait, and another line traced the return shot from the shooter's offset hide to the enemy's position. The description was simple: dual position counter-sniper method, Eastern Front. The text did not mention her name. The method had, by then, become part of common practice, its parentage blurred. That anonymity might have bothered some. To her, had she seen it, it likely would have felt fitting. The goal had never been to carve her initials into doctrine, only to keep her friends alive long enough to see another dawn. Far from museums and training schools, in small towns and cramped apartments, the memory of her took on a more intimate form. Veterans who had once shared her sectors told children and grandchildren stories in which she appeared as a steady, precise presence who seemed always to materialize where she was needed most. Family members remembered her not for her tally, but for how she stirred tea or the way her voice softened when she talked about ordinary things. In one living room, a photograph of a plain-looking woman in a uniform hung alongside pictures of weddings and summer picnics. When a curious child asked who she was, an older relative would say, "That's your aunt's friend, the one who knew how to make shooters waste all their bullets." The child would nod without really understanding. Years later, perhaps they would read a book and realize who had once sat at their table. Meanwhile, the larger world moved on to new figures and new crises. Her name appeared now and then in documentaries or articles, usually linked to impressive numbers and the novelty of a gender. Commentators debated whether modern ethics would allow someone to be celebrated for such a tally. Others pointed out that she had not made the war. She had simply refused to let it pass over her without resistance. If there was a thread that ran consistently through the many ways people later spoke about her, it was this: she did not treat herself as exceptional. In interviews, in recorded conversations, in recollections from those who knew her, she insisted that she had been one person among many who had each done what they could with what they had. Her crazy trick, the one that set her apart in tactical manuals, was in her mind simply the application of a basic realization that if you know the enemy is watching for a certain pattern, the worst thing you can do is repeat it for their convenience. It was a lesson that outlived her by decades, surfacing not only on battlefields, but in other arenas where people found themselves up against opponents who thought they knew exactly how they would behave. In the final years of her life, the war felt both close and distant. Small things brought it back with startling clarity: a certain angle of morning light on a wall, the crack of a car backfiring in the street, the smell of wet earth after a storm. At other times, it seemed like something that had happened to someone else entirely, a long, intense dream she had woken from into a world that expected her to go quietly about daily routines. She rarely spoke about numbers at home. To her family, the count of 309 appeared mostly in books and articles, not in the everyday stories she chose to tell at the dinner table. When they pressed her, she tended to answer in fragments. "I tried to make sure every shot mattered," she would say. "That's all." If they asked about fear, she admitted to it freely. "Of course I was afraid," she would reply. The trick is not to be unafraid. The trick is to decide what you want to happen more than you want to avoid the fear. Occasionally, a visitor, a historian, a younger officer, a journalist, would come to her small apartment, notebook or recorder in hand. They wanted details: how she had placed her decoys, how far apart her hides had been, what she had thought when she first used herself as bait. She shared what she remembered, careful not to embellish. Time had blurred some specifics, but the structure of those days remained clear. When one particularly earnest interviewer asked her what single piece of advice she would give to someone facing an opponent who seemed stronger, she paused for a long moment. "Don't let them write all the rules," she said finally. "If you follow their expectations from beginning to end, you're already cooperating with your own defeat. Sometimes you have to do something that looks unreasonable to change the shape of the situation." The interviewer, thinking of textbooks, jotted down "be unpredictable" as a summary. But what she had meant went deeper, not chaos for its own sake, but carefully chosen deviations from pattern, designed to reclaim initiative. As her health declined, the state that had once pinned medals to her chest did something simple and correct. It ensured she did not have to worry about basic needs. She received a modest pension, periodic visits from officials on commemorative days, and invitations, many of which she declined, to attend ceremonies and stand for photographs. When she did appear at such events, standing alongside other veterans, she always felt a little uneasy about how much emphasis people placed on her story compared to those who had carried ammunition, driven supply trucks, worked in factories, cared for the wounded. Their contributions had no flashy numbers attached, yet without them, she knew, her own efforts would have been meaningless. On the day she left the world, it happened quietly, without drama. An illness the doctors had tracked for some time finally moved past what they could manage. She was not old by modern standards, but she had lived at a level of strain in her youth that few bodies forget. The funeral was dignified, attended by family, a handful of old comrades, and representatives from military organizations who laid wreaths and spoke of courage. Newspapers carried brief notices. They mentioned her as a decorated veteran, as a symbol of resistance, as the most effective female sniper on record. Some added a line about her later years as an instructor and mentor. The space available for such summaries was small. No article could fully capture the thousands of hours she had spent in cold ruins, the mental tightrope of using herself as bait, the weight of memory she had carried afterward. And yet, in a way, she did not need those articles. Her work, for better and worse, had long since flowed into the world's bloodstream of knowledge. Techniques she had pioneered were now simply how it is done. Concepts she had tested under fire had turned into bullet points on training slides. The person had gone. The ideas remained. If there is a single image that best captures who she was beyond the myth, it might not be the famous photograph of her in full uniform, medals across her chest, staring level at the camera. It might instead be an imagined snapshot on that first morning in the ruins, a young woman pressed behind a crumbling wall, watching a distant muzzle about to take a comrade's life, choosing in that instant to act, and discovering that she could. From there, everything else unfolded. The long series of equations solved at the end of a scope, the decision to break doctrine when it no longer protected her people, the evolution of a crazy trick into accepted practice, the transformation of one person's stubborn refusal to be predictable into a model for countless others. Her story is not comfortable. It involves taking lives, even if the language we use softens it to eliminations and neutralizations. It forces us to confront the reality that sometimes, in order to protect one group of humans, another must be stopped with finality. But it also offers something else, a reminder that even in the most impersonal, industrial conflict, individual judgment still matters. A single mind, refusing to accept that the existing rules are sufficient, can ripple outward in ways no one at the time can predict. The title that draws people to her story, How One Female Sniper's Crazy Trick Removed Hundreds of Opponents in Less Than a Year, captures only the hook. The real substance lies in everything behind that trick: the burned library, the recruitment argument, the friends lost because they followed the manual too faithfully, the lonely hours spent mapping enemy habits, the willingness to step into the open and trust her own calculations. If you strip away the uniforms and flags, what remains is a person who, when confronted with a situation where doing what she was told was getting people around her lost, decided to think for herself and act. That decision, repeated again and again under pressure, is what turned a history student into someone whose methods would quietly influence battlefields for generations. In that sense, her legacy reaches beyond snipers, beyond soldiers, beyond the particular conflict in which she lived. It speaks to anyone who has ever looked at a set of rules and realized that survival, or justice, or progress requires more than obedience. It requires the courage to become, for a calculated moment, the bait that changes the game.